The highway cut through southern Georgia like a quiet scar, long, sun-baked, and mostly forgotten. Brigadier General Malcolm R. Stokes had driven this stretch of 218 more times than he could count. He knew the turns, the faded billboards, the stubborn trees that refused to move for time or progress. But today, something felt different. Off. Not the road him. He was a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his late 50s. His skin the shade of mahogany, lined with years of service and resolve. Off duty today in a polo and slacks, no visible rank, no polished shoes or cap with stars. His jacket with military insignia lay folded neatly in the back seat. He didn't wear his command when he didn't have to. He'd earned the right to just be a man. But in America, especially this part of it, a black man alone on the side of the road was never just a man. When his GPS glitched out some failed update, probably he spotted a gravel pull-off and took it, stopping just past a sign for Ellington. A minute, maybe two. That's all he needed. He parked, tapped his phone screen, waited for signal to catch. Then came the sound that turned his stomach. Tires on gravel. He looked up. Rear view mirror. A sheriff's cruiser easing in behind him. No siren. Lights already spinning. The air changed heavier somehow. Familiar. The door creaked open. A white female deputy stepped out, one hand on her holstered weapon, her eyes already set. She didn't see a decorated officer. She didn't see a citizen. She saw a threat. She marched straight toward his window. No smile. No good afternoon. Just a sharp rap of knuckles. Tap. 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 Malcolm lowered the window halfway and spoke first. "Afternoon, officer." She didn't reply, just narrowed her gaze. And in that split second, Malcolm felt the weight return not of his rank, but of history. He had survived war zones, but this was America. She didn't ask for license and registration. She didn't ask if he was okay. She leaned in just far enough to assert her space as if the air between them belonged to her. "What are you doing out here?" she snapped again, like the first time hadn't registered. Malcolm kept his voice calm, his posture easy. "Pulled over to reset my GPS." Her eyes flicked to the passenger seat, then to the back, then back to his hands resting plainly on the wheel. "Where you headed?" He glanced at the name stitched onto her uniform. Whitlow. Deputy K. Whitlow. The name meant nothing to him, but her tone meant everything. It wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion wrapped in a badge. "Correcting my route," he said simply. She straightened, took a half step back, then undid the strap on her holster. The sound was small but deafening. "I'm gonna need you to step out of the vehicle." He blinked once. "For checking my GPS?" "This is private land. We've had issues with illegal dumping. You fit the profile." Malcolm let that phrase sit in the air like smoke. You fit the profile. He'd heard those words before, in briefings, in interrogation rooms overseas, but never pointed at him. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm a federal officer. My credentials are in my vehicle." "I said step out of the car." She took a step back, hand now fully resting on her weapon. She wasn't de-escalating. She was waiting, hoping for defiance. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, popped the handle, and slowly pushed the door open. His movements were deliberate, calculated not for her, but for the bystanders he hoped were watching. He stepped out, standing straight. He didn't raise his voice. "I've done nothing wrong." "You're being uncooperative," she shot back, his brow furrowed. "I've complied with every word you've said." She motioned him to the back of the car. No backup, no body cam that he could see. Only the quiet rustle of trees and the subtle shift of a pickup truck slowing on the highway. Malcolm placed his hands on the trunk, his eyes forward. He wasn't afraid. He was prepared. That's what years of training gave you, not immunity from injustice, but discipline when it arrived. "Ma'am," he said again calmly, "you're making a mistake." But she didn't hear it, or maybe she didn't care. Her grip was harder than necessary. As soon as Malcolm's hands touched the trunk, Deputy Whitlow moved in fast, yanking one arm behind his back, twisting it upward until the tendons in his shoulder flared. He didn't resist. He didn't flinch. He only clenched his jaw as she kicked his feet apart. "You're interfering with an investigation," she muttered, pulling out a pair of steel cuffs. "There's no investigation," Malcolm said quietly. "There's only you and a decision you haven't thought through." Whitlow ignored him. The cuffs snapped shut, too tight. He winced, not from pain from the insult of it. From the road, a pickup truck had stopped. A woman in the passenger seat rolled down her window just enough to aim her phone. In the bed of the truck, a teenage boy had already begun recording. His arms rested on the edge, eyes wide, phone steady. No one spoke. Not yet. But the silence felt charged, like the pause before lightning strikes. Malcolm could feel it shift, the tension moving from him to her. Whitlow's breathing was shallow now. Not from effort, from adrenaline, from panic. "Ma'am," Malcolm said again, calm as ever, "I am Brigadier General Malcolm R. Stokes. My identification is in my briefcase. I am not armed. You have escalated this beyond necessity." Whitlow's eyes flicked toward the onlookers, then back to him. Her jaw was tight, her pride tighter. "You expect me to believe that?" "You don't have to believe it, just verify it." But she didn't. Instead, she stepped back and pressed her radio, voice low and clipped. "Dispatch, I've got a suspicious male, possibly armed, requesting backup. Location County Road 18, eastbound shoulder." Malcolm turned his head slightly, enough to catch the teenager's phone still pointed in his direction. The boy's father now stood beside him, arms crossed, face unreadable. The look of a man who'd seen too much of this before. "You people are always carrying something," Whitlow muttered, more to herself than to him. Malcolm's jaw tensed. "You people?" She didn't respond. The cuffs bit deeper into his wrists. His back ached against the edge of the trunk. But he didn't beg. He didn't plead. He simply said, just loud enough for the recording to catch, "This isn't how you treat a citizen, and it's certainly not how you treat a general." She didn't hear it, not truly, but the camera did, and soon, so would the world. The cruiser door slammed shut behind him, and for a moment, the world narrowed to a cage of metal and glass. The cuffs dug into his wrists, resting awkwardly between his spine and the seat back. Malcolm Stokes closed his eyes, just briefly, and began to breathe. In, out. 1, 2, 3. Outside, Deputy Whitlow paced in front of her vehicle, speaking into the radio with rapid, clipped tones. Her eyes darted toward the growing cluster of bystanders, toward the teenager still filming, toward the man she'd just locked in the back seat like a common criminal. Inside, Malcolm remained still, composed. He knew panic wouldn't save him, but precision might. When the second deputy arrived, a tall, solid black man with a salt and pepper beard and the air of someone who'd seen both justice and its failures, Malcolm watched closely. The man approached the cruiser slowly, eyes scanning. There was no weapon drawn, no barked command. "Sir," the deputy said, opening the rear door carefully. "Name?" "Brigadier General Malcolm R. Stokes," Malcolm answered evenly. "United States Army. I have been unlawfully detained. My ID is in my briefcase. I've requested to make a call." The deputy paused, then gave a short nod. He reached into his own pocket and offered a phone. Malcolm took it, hands still cuffed behind him, twisting his torso just enough to dial. He didn't need to look at the keypad. He knew the number by heart. Only 3 people in the entire Department of Defense had ever held that line. 1 ring, 2. "This is Colonel Benjamin Reese." "Colonel, this is General Stokes. I'm in Pine County, Georgia, detained roadside by a local deputy, requesting immediate verification of ID and jurisdiction. Civilians are recording. I believe the situation may escalate if unchecked." Reese's voice sharpened instantly. "Are you secure, sir?" "For the moment. But I need confirmation routed through the Pentagon to local dispatch. Now." "You'll have it in under 10 minutes." Malcolm ended the call and handed the phone back to the deputy. The deputy's eyes had changed. There was recognition now, and something else, a quiet respect. He didn't speak, just stepped away and began his own call, low and direct. Outside, Deputy Whitlow was no longer pacing with certainty. Her movements were sharp but anxious. Her eyes kept drifting toward her cruiser, toward the man inside. She hadn't just misjudged him. She'd underestimated who he was. And now, the uniform she couldn't see was about to make itself known, not through shouting, not through force, but through the gravity of a single, well-placed call. The gravel crackled under new tires, heavier, lower to the ground, deliberate, not police cruisers. These moved with silent authority. 3 black SUVs, windows tinted beyond legal limits, turned onto the shoulder like they'd already been cleared to pass through any roadblock. Deputy Whitlow turned at the sound, confusion flickering across her face. She'd expected backup. Instead, she got something else entirely. The SUVs stopped in sequence. Doors opened not in a rush, but in practiced timing. From the first vehicle stepped Colonel Angela McCrae, dressed in crisp Army uniform, every pin and ribbon gleaming. Two federal agents in dark suits followed, speaking into earpieces as they scanned the crowd. The onlookers had grown 5 cars now parked along the roadside. Phones were still raised, recording, documenting. McCrae walked straight past Deputy Whitlow, not sparing her a glance. Her eyes were locked on the cruiser. She opened the back door herself. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice calm but heavy with command. "You all right?" Malcolm nodded. Physically, yes. She turned to the deputy who had offered the phone earlier, Deputy Reuben Tate, and asked simply, "Who initiated the stop?" Tate lifted a hand toward Whitlow but didn't say much else. His silence said enough. McCrae turned, slow and deliberate, until she was facing Whitlow. "Do you know who that man is?" she asked evenly. Whitlow squared her shoulders. "He refused to provide proper ID. I was following procedure." McCrae didn't blink. "He gave you his name. He gave you his status." "You cuffed a brigadier general with federal clearance and locked him in a car without verifying credentials you were holding in your hand." "I acted on suspicion," Whitlow said quickly, but the edge in her voice had dulled. His behavior was evasive. "No," McCrae replied. "Your bias was loud. His behavior was measured." For the first time, Whitlow hesitated, truly hesitated, as if something had finally pierced the armor of her authority. From the SUV, one of the agents approached and handed McCrae a folder already printed, already verified. Inside, Malcolm's full personnel file, Pentagon clearance level, and 3 commendations for service in combat. McCrae looked at Whitlow once more. "This is no longer your scene. Step back." And for the first time that day, Deputy Karen Whitlow didn't have anything to say. She just stepped back, and the control she'd clung to so tightly began to unravel, right there in front of the cameras. The hum of tension vibrated through the humid air as the dust trail of a 4th vehicle approached, slower this time. Older. A county-issued pickup truck rolled in, lights off, engine steady. The man behind the wheel didn't rush. Sheriff Warren Dillard stepped out like someone who had nothing to prove, tall, broad across the shoulders, his gray Stetson pulled low. His gait was marked by a limp, not fresh but permanent, earned from years chasing trouble down back roads. He paused at the edge of the scene, taking it in. Federal agents flanking black SUVs, a uniformed Army colonel, a crowd twice the size it was an hour ago, and Deputy Whitlow, arms locked across her chest, her knuckles turning pale. Dillard adjusted his hat. "Someone want to tell me what in God's name is going on here?" he asked, not yelling, but his voice carried like thunder. Colonel McCrae stepped forward. "Sheriff Dillard, I'm Colonel Angela McCrae, Department of the Army. One of your deputies detained a senior officer under false pretense. There was no verification. There was no cause. We have it all documented." The sheriff turned his head toward the cruiser, where Malcolm now stood outside, his cuffs removed by Deputy Tate moments earlier. His wrists were raw, but his posture still dignified, still quiet. "You the one they had in the back seat?" Dillard asked. "Yes, sir," Malcolm replied simply. Dillard let out a low sigh, then turned back to Whitlow. "That true, Karen?" Whitlow stiffened. He was evasive. His plates weren't local. He matched a dumping profile. "I followed protocol." "You check his tags?" "No, sir." "You check the ID he gave you?" "I didn't think it was real." The words hung in the air like a confession. Dillard's face hardened. "Didn't think it was real," he repeated. "You had a man standing right in front of you telling you who he was, and instead of listening, you threw cuffs on a decorated general like he was a damn shoplifter." Whitlow opened her mouth, but no words came out. The crowd was utterly silent now, a living courtroom. Dillard turned to Malcolm and offered his hand. "General Stokes, on behalf of this county, I apologize. We may wear the same badges, but we damn sure don't all live by the same code." Malcolm shook his hand, firm but without bitterness. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "this isn't about an apology. It's about accountability." And for once, Dillard didn't argue. He just nodded, because in that moment, it was clear. The badge wasn't the highest authority in the room anymore. Decency was. By nightfall, the gravel shoulder off Highway 218 had emptied, the SUVs were gone, the cruiser towed, the crowd dispersed. But the silence that returned wasn't peace, it was aftershock. The first clip hit social media at 6:47 p.m., posted by Miles Trotter, the teenager in the truck bed. 37 seconds, no commentary, just raw footage. A black man calmly identifying himself, a white deputy snapping cuffs on him anyway. The caption was simple. He said he was a general, she didn't care. By 10 p.m., the video had 300,000 views. By dawn, it was on CNN. Local news anchors tripped over phrases like unfortunate misunderstanding and pending internal investigation. But the public didn't flinch. They had eyes, they had ears, and most importantly, they had the tape. Across Georgia, veterans started speaking out, men and women in uniform, past and present, posting side-by-side photos. One of General Stokes in fatigues, receiving commendations. The other, a still of him bent over his trunk in handcuffs. One post read, 30 years of service, one roadside stop. Guess which one defines him now? At a high school outside Atlanta, students walked out of class wearing makeshift pins with Stokes' name printed in black ink. At Fort Griffin, young cadets whispered about it between drills, asking each other how they'd respond in his shoes. A few called him the quiet general. And through it all, Malcolm said nothing. No press statement, no camera, no podium. He returned to his base, resumed his duties, briefed junior officers, reviewed logistics, ate in the mess like nothing had changed. Except it had. Even the silence around him felt different, heavier with respect, sharper with awareness. His presence had become a lesson no training manual could teach, how to carry honor in the face of humiliation. Meanwhile, in Pine County, pressure mounted. Protesters gathered outside the sheriff's office, not in droves, but enough to be heard. They held signs that didn't scream, but cut deep. He stood tall, so should we. Respect has no uniform. Sheriff Dillard released a public statement. We are reviewing the conduct of all officers involved. No one is above scrutiny. But the people weren't waiting for statements. They had seen what mattered. They had seen truth, caught on camera, and they weren't about to let it fade. The country was talking. Hashtags were trending. Panels debated. Politicians weighed in with carefully worded sound bites. But in the quiet office at Fort Griffin, General Malcolm R. Stokes sat alone reviewing mission briefs, signing deployment orders, and answering no calls from the press. He hadn't declined out of anger. He simply believed that sometimes the loudest message was the one unspoken. He watched the videos, though. Not all of them. Just one. The original clip, filmed by Miles. No music, no edits. Just the truth, in real time. Malcolm watched himself get cuffed again, not out of vanity or pain, but precision, studying it like a battlefield replay. The camera had caught everything. His posture, his tone, the exact moment Whitlow grabbed his wrist. The sigh he let out when she refused to check his ID. It didn't enrage him. It exhausted him. He closed the laptop and opened a leather-bound journal, a gift from his wife, Lena. On the first page, he wrote 2 words, calm winds. That night, Lena called from their home in Augusta. Her voice was soft but strained. They want you to speak. CNN, NPR, even the Pentagon's press office is asking. I know. And? I'm not done listening yet. Silence passed between them, the kind that didn't need filling. Meanwhile, the past crept up. Old complaints about Deputy Whitlow began surfacing. A black delivery driver detained for loitering outside a pharmacy. A young mother followed home and cited for attitude. All dismissed quietly. No footage, no attention. But now everything was different. Local papers began running op-eds. Churches held forums. Schools opened discussions about power, perception, and profiling. At a barbershop in Macon, a photo of Malcolm in uniform was taped to the mirror. The caption beneath it handwritten, "Be still, be steel." And still, Malcolm said nothing. Because silence, when chosen not forced, can hold the weight of truth better than 1,000 speeches. He wasn't hiding. He was anchoring, grounding himself before the next step. Because he knew the moment would come when the silence had said enough, and that's when the real voice would matter. The auditorium wasn't grand wood-paneled walls, fold-out chairs, a podium that creaked when touched. It was held inside a community college gymnasium just outside Tallahassee. No major cameras, no political fanfare, just teachers, paramedics, city workers, and a scattering of high school students' faces marked more by exhaustion than influence. General Malcolm R. Stokes stepped onto the small stage in a dark suit. No ribbons, no medals, no stars on his shoulders. Just a lapel pin, the eagle and flag worn modestly over his heart. He looked out at the crowd and waited. There was no applause, only quiet. "I want to talk," he began, "about restraint." He let the word settle. Not silence, not passivity. Restraint. The kind that takes strength. Because when you're humiliated, when someone tries to strip away your dignity, Every part of you wants to hit back, to shout, to break something just to prove you still exist. A beat. But power isn't measured by how hard you hit. It's measured by how much you choose not to. A murmur moved through the room. A shift. You can't control how people see you, he continued. You can't control their fears, their assumptions, their ignorance, but you can control how you respond when they get it wrong. A young woman in an EMT uniform raised her hand. How did you stay so calm that day? Malcolm gave a faint smile, not rehearsed, just human. Because my life wasn't in that moment, he said. It was in everything that came before it. That woman didn't know my story, but I did. That line landed heavier than the silence before it. Another student asked, "Were you angry?" "Yes," Malcolm said without hesitation. "But I don't carry it, I use it. Anger, when carried, weighs you down. But when you sharpen it, when you aim it, it becomes something else. It becomes clarity." The room didn't erupt. It leaned in. They didn't need slogans. They needed stillness. They needed someone who had walked through fire and chose not to burn everything behind him. When the session ended, people stood not in ovation, but in acknowledgement. Heads bowed, hands folded, some with tears they didn't want noticed. Outside, Miles Trotter waited by the door, phone in hand, not recording, just waiting. Malcolm stopped beside him. "You still filming?" he asked. Miles nodded. "Only the truth, sir." Malcolm placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Then don't stop." 2 days after the leadership forum, the official statement came down. Deputy Karen Whitlow was terminated from the Pine County Sheriff's Department effective immediately. The charges were clear: excessive use of force, failure to follow verification protocols, and abuse of authority. But behind closed doors, Sheriff Warren Dillard said it plain to his staff: "She got caught doing what some of us been ignoring. That's on all of us." The news made local headlines, then state, then national again. Not because it was rare, but because this time there were consequences, and something shifted. At the high school where Miles Trotter studied, a new elective was introduced: ethics in public power. Officers were invited into classrooms not to lecture, but to listen. At churches across rural Georgia, sermons swapped tradition for conversation. At town halls, residents who had never stood up before now spoke with steady voices and phones in hand. Sheriff Dillard, for all his old-school ways, instituted a reform package that included independent oversight, implicit bias training, and civilian review panels. He brought in community leaders, not as photo ops, but as partners. General Stokes never appeared on cable news. He never sought a book deal or sat for a documentary. Instead, he returned to his base, his staff, and his calling. And when the next class of cadets stood before him in their pressed uniforms, he didn't lecture about tactics or rank. He said this: "Wearing this uniform gives you authority, but only you can give it meaning. Don't mistake fear for respect, and don't confuse silence with peace, because sometimes justice isn't loud, it just stands steady and refuses to move." That quote found its way onto the wall of the academy. Beneath it, a still image: Malcolm standing beside his car, cuffed, unbroken. And as for Miles, he kept filming. His YouTube channel, Only the Truth, became a quiet force online. No drama, no clickbait, just stories. Veterans, teachers, neighbors, all talking about what integrity looks like when no one's watching. One evening, months later, Malcolm watched one of Miles's new uploads. Then he stepped outside into the dusky air, where the sky still held the soft echo of sunset. He wasn't proud, he wasn't vindicated, he was just certain. Because in the end, it wasn't rank or anger that changed the story. It was the decision to stand still while the world was finally forced to look. In a world that often rewards noise and reaction, the story of General Malcolm Stokes reminds us that true strength lies in restraint. When faced with injustice, he didn't shout, he didn't retaliate. He stood firm, calm, dignified, and unwavering in the face of prejudice. For older generations who have witnessed decades of social change, this is a powerful lesson: that dignity is not weakness, and that sometimes the most powerful protest is to hold your ground without losing your composure. This story also teaches us that accountability isn't a modern invention, it's a moral inheritance. When authority is misused, silence can be complicity. But when one man chooses to lead by example, it can ripple outward into communities, classrooms, and even legislation. Let us remember, it's not always grand speeches or angry marches that change the world. Sometimes it's a quiet man in handcuffs refusing to bow his head and a nation finally being forced to lift its eyes. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.